The recruitment of prisoners by Wagner Group was a symptom of the very serious illness of the Russian state. Because effectively, the link between crime and punishment was dismantled at that moment.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You are watching or listening to an OSW interview. Today I'm talking to Dr. Maria Domańska, an expert from OSW's Russian department. We'll be discussing endemic violence in Russia. Hi, Maria.
Hi, Nick.
Okay, so we're going to talk about violence in Russia. I know that if you look online, you can see very many quite disturbing examples, and anyone who's connected with Russia anyway can think of some anecdotes of some quite terrible incidents. But would you say that violence in Russia is clearly worse than in other countries?
Yes, it is, definitely. And this is not much about the scale of violence, although it's quite significant. And it's actually increasing. It's been increasing over recent years. It's mostly about some systemic factors, because if we are thinking about democratic countries, in some of them the level of violence is quite high, like in the US, for example. But the fundamental difference between democratic countries and Russia lie in two basic things. First, at the level of political discourse, social norms, violence is widely treated as pathology. So it's not the norm in any way. It's something contrary to the norm. And second, you have the rule of law. You have independent judiciary. You have law enforcement bodies that mostly try to redress somehow all the negative effects of violence. Both things are lacking in Russia. In Russia, we face widespread violence, which is deeply entrenched in the political system and in social relations. And the distinguishing feature of that is that this violence is promoted by the state. Mm-hmm. It's a top-down phenomenon. So the state is actually vitally interested in stoking violence in the society and in the political system. And this is one of the tools of state management. And of course, you don't have any rule of law in Russia, and judiciary and law enforcement bodies are, in fact, parts of this violence-based system of oppression.
And what would be the purpose of increasing violence in society?
This comes from the very nature of Russian authoritarian system. Russian current political leadership are people who come mostly, I'm talking now about the top decision makers. These people come mostly from the former KGB, so the Soviet apparatus of repression. And these people think adequately to their past experiences. And also these people are behaving and thinking in a very mafia-style criminal way. Many of them were actually involved in mafia activities in the 90s. Mm-hmm. So this is an explosive mix of Chekist, former KGB, and criminal thinking and values and patterns of behavior. And this style of political management means that violence is a natural tool of managing the state and society. So we have a huge scale of repression in Russia, which has been increasing actually, especially since the full-scale invasion against Ukraine started. We have also all kinds of unofficial or semi-official of illegal methods of harassing the society, citizens, for all kinds, for example, of anti-regime or anti-war views. But in fact, this gloomy picture is something very natural to how Russian political leadership perceives the world. So we're dealing in the Russian case, we are dealing with a very peculiar domino effect of repression and violence. If you want to manage the state and rule in a violent way, you have to open the way, somehow open the opportunities for citizens to vent their frustration coming from the state-sponsored violence on the vulnerable, for example. So an oppressed citizen who is highly disempowered, disenfranchised, and they feel that they cannot influence anyway the situation because the state keeps the citizens' views and their behavior, their attitudes under tight scrutiny, the citizens try to vent this frustration and also paradoxically look for a very peculiar way to re-empower themselves by exerting violence on the others, by venting this.
And who are these others? Are these people weaker than themselves, so minorities or women?
Women, children, minorities. They can be also like clients of the state agencies. So you are basically humiliated by your state, by the stronger from your birth until you die. And violence is a very much an everyday experience for Russians. We have statistics on that. For example, we have very high level of domestic violence in Russia. According to independent research, around 70% of women who are killed in Russia, I mean the overall number, the 70% of them are the victims of domestic violence. And which is the worst thing about it is that the state most often doesn't intervene. I mean, we know plenty of cases where, for example, deaths of women victims of domestic violence could have been avoided if the police had reacted in a proper way. But even if a victim repetitively asks for help, it's very often that the police don't react in any way. We also have some independent research by Levada Center made before the war, where around 10% of respondents said that they were victims of serious, heavy physical or psychological violence from the law enforcement representatives. And around a quarter of respondents said that they were victims of broadly defined harassment by the state law enforcement officers. We also know that the majority of women convicted of homicide who are in prison at present, in fact, defended themselves against domestic violence. We know that in Russian schools and universities, psychological violence is widespread. We also have some proof of much more rare cases of physical violence, but physical violence also is also present in the educational system. We face,
but it's tolerated rather than enshrined in the Constitution. I assume that corporal punishment in schools is illegal.
Of course. So we have a huge abyss between constitutional regulations, for example, or formal legal regulations enshrined in all kinds of laws. And we have a broad sphere of illegal practices. But with the educational system is, I think, much more complicated because educational system has also fallen victim to the mass so-called patriotic propaganda of the time of war. So very, I would say, detrimental ideas are being promoted, like hate, like a very false notion of patriotism defined as hate against enemies. At history lessons, pupils and students can learn that territorial annexations are good, that the state has superiority over citizens. So citizens' rights are much less important than the state's rights and state's interests. You have the cult of authoritarian power. Now, students are being taught that war is a normal tool of foreign policy, a normal tool of solving international disputes, for example. So this is also about this atmosphere permeating the social life, also the life in educational institutions. And against this background, psychological violence by teachers or by officials supervising the education system in Russia is treated as something normal. And also what is important and probably can be shocking for our Western colleagues is that law enforcement bodies and all kinds of so-called patriots, including representatives of the army or, in fact, illegal military groupings, can interfere into the school life. And, for example, they keep under tight scrutiny the views of the children and their parents. And we have plenty of cases of actual harassment of children, of minors and their parents for anti-war views, for example.
These stories are known from communist times. Is it the case that it stopped and it returned, or was this constantly present in Russia and the Soviet Union?
I would say that it stopped and then it returned because the 90s was a exemption from the rule, I think. When I'm talking about the rule, I'm talking centuries of actually entrenching the rule of violence, entrenching the rule of mass violent indoctrination of people in Russia, in Russian Empire, on the Soviet Union. It stopped in the 90s, and this short period of freedom was something really good because we had pluralism in Russia, we had freedom of views, freedom of speech, things like that. But unfortunately, at the same time, Russia was a highly criminalized state. And people usually associate the 90s not with freedoms, but with economic collapse and with criminalization of their everyday lives. So when Putin came to power, most people perceived it as a positive sign that now we will have order again. Now we will live better. So in fact, Putin restored all kinds of the worst Soviet practices that we know from the darkest chapters of the Soviet history. And now, effectively, all kinds of potential resistance against the regime is totally impossible. It has been suppressed with repression, with indoctrination, with propaganda, and Russians currently are living in a very, very bleak reality.
So I wanted to talk about repression of opponents of the political regime in Russia. Probably the most famous example is Navalny, who has been put in prison. Is this a fairly normal practice for political opponents in Russia?
Well, we can say it's normal from the point of view of the logic of the regime. It's not common so far, fortunately. So now we have just a handful of leading oppositional figures, political opponents of Putin, who have been put in jail on trumped-up charges. And the persecution was clearly politically motivated. So first Navalny was poisoned, then put in jail, and now he faces around another 19 years or something in prison. On the charges of alleged extremism. We also have Vladimir Kara-Murza, another well-known opposition figure who has been twice poisoned before the war and has been recently put in jail for 25 years on the charge of state treason. So this is also a new quality in the system, because political repression is nothing new in Russia. But since the war started, the verdicts have started to be much harsher than before. So now we have around 20 years in prison for political figures. Even before the war, a journalist, Ivan Saforonov, got 20 years in prison also, and people who are convicted of the so-called spreading of fake news about the activities of Russian army in Ukraine, which means telling the truth about Russian war crimes in Ukraine. People like that get 5, 8 to 10 years in prison on average. So this is a new quality. I mean,
and how are conditions in prisons? Is there a lot of violence in the prisons as well?
The conditions are deplorable. There is a lot of violence, and what is most serious about it, this is, again, state-promoted violence. In 2021, so even, again, before the war, one of the human rights watchdogs, the prisoners' rights watchdogs, publicized data on mass systemic torture in Russian prisons. And that torture was organized by the Federal Penitentiary Service and the FSB. So by the same law enforcement bodies and secret services who are theoretically supposed to protect Russian citizens. We have also in Russia. These are data of the Council of Europe of 2021 or 2020, and these data reveal that in Russia there was one of the highest proportion of prisoners per 100,000 of the population. The state budget, I mean the part of state budget devoted to the maintenance of prisons and prisoners is really ridiculously low. The medicine in prisons is virtually nothing. I mean, it's in really dire state. And in the case of many people, long prison sentences can mean effectively death sentences. They are not properly treated by doctors because of the lack of money, but also because of the total lack of empathy, good training and procedures, and this overwhelming culture of violence that permeates also Russian prisons. And again, in my opinion, this is being done on purpose, because if you want to make the people silent and not protest against your policies, you have to intimidate them with this prospect of getting into a prison. Prison must be widely perceived as hell. This is a very efficient tool of intimidation and a tool of prevention of any resistance and protest.
Could I also ask, because I read somewhere that you wrote that it's a very similar picture in psychiatric hospitals?
Yes, this is another really gloomy sphere of Russian life. And well, these are two topics inside this broader topic, because we have a very bad situation with human rights, patients' rights in psychiatric hospitals. I should start with saying that it is extremely easy to be put into a psychiatric hospital, and extremely difficult often to be freed from that, from there. And the rights of patients of psychiatric hospitals are violated on a mass scale. This partially stems from the general contempt for the weak in this Russian culture of violence. It partially stems from, again, the lack of money, and it partially stems from the overarching paradigm of impunity that reigns in every single sphere of Russian life. And this comes again from the impunity of the political leadership for everything they do, And this idea of impunity is transferred from the top to the bottom of the society. But another alarming topic is that Putin has revived the very dark Soviet tradition of the so-called repressive psychiatry. It means using psychiatry as a tool of political persecution, of political repression. So from time to time, we hear about people who have been forcibly put under psychiatric treatment in psychiatric hospitals, and they just for their political views, for example, for the anti-war views. And it's not only about the repressive practices employed by the state. It's also about reviving the Soviet time idea that, oh my God, you must be insane if you are against the system. You must be insane if you are against the war. So this is, again, something that is not maybe official, not visible at first sight, but again, contributes to this overwhelming culture of tolerance towards violence. Because we must also say that it's not that, like a majority of Russians uses violence as a means of their social relations. But what we deal with is a mass tolerance and passive acceptance of violence. The passive acceptance of the violence exerted by the state because people don't have any alternative and they know that they will be severely punished for any resistance or protest. But also it trickles down to a lower level of societal relations. So people passively accept violence from law enforcement bodies. Also, domestic violence is largely passively accepted as something natural, as a natural element of the traditional system of values, which is actively being promoted by the state and by the Orthodox Church. There have been some very interesting independent research on how many victims of domestic violence actually report these cases to the police. And it's only 18% of women, while around 40% of women say that they have been victims of physical violence at home during their lifetime. And also the reasons why they don't report are interesting, because women usually say that they didn't report because of shame, because of humiliation, because of their uncertainty about receiving any help. And this uncertainty is actually very well grounded, because I think in most cases the police just don't react properly or don't react at all.
Okay, so I'd like to move on to the war, but I'm going to start by stepping back to, you mentioned the violence which is seen in prisons. So definitely in the Western media, we heard very much about the Wagner group recruiting mercenaries from Russian prisons to go and fight in Ukraine. Could you tell us something about that system?
The recruitment of prisoners by Wagner group was a symptom of the very serious illness of the Russian state, because effectively the link between crime and punishment was dismantled at that moment. So if you commit murder and you are convicted by a legal court verdict, and then someone comes and says, okay, you can be freed immediately if you agree to go to the front lines and fight against Ukrainians. And that was done without any legal regulation, in fact. I mean, there was allegedly some secret Putin's order, some secret Putin's decree to free prisoners. But even within the framework of the Russian law, it was really illegal, an illegal practice. So prisoners were freed illegally, and then they went to the front lines to commit war crimes. And what is worse, after Wagner Group was cut off the recruitment of prisoners at the beginning of this year, the Ministry of Defense took over the stuff and they continued the recruitment. And basically everything is like before. I mean, there is no legal justification for freeing prisoners from prisons. And also some cases of torture were reported against prisoners who refused to go to the front line. The same thing, by the way, affects Russian soldiers, those who refuse to go to Ukraine to fight, or those who refuse to come back to Ukraine after some period of military service. Sometimes they're being tortured or harassed or oppressed in many ways with the use of physical or psychological violence. With prisoners, what is the worst thing about this phenomenon of destroying the link between the crime and punishment, of undermining the whole idea of judicial verdict and the functioning of the whole judiciary, is that the Supreme Court has recently ruled that fighting in Ukraine can be treated as a quite important mitigating circumstance in the case of many criminals. So you can be convicted of a murder, then go to the front, and you are treated as a free person. That because you have redeemed your guilt.
Paid your debt to society.
You paid your debt, not to society. This is another thing I'm going to mention in a while. But you redeemed your guilt and paid your debt. Then you can come back to Russia and commit another crime and avoid punishment if you agree to go to Ukraine again. This is the current system. Why did I say that it's not debt to society? Because the whole philosophy, it's not explicit, but the whole philosophy behind it is that as a criminal, you have a debt vis-a-vis your state, not vis-a-vis your society. So this is the state that decides whether to punish you or to absolve you. And society doesn't have any voice in this procedure, let's say. In legal terms, it of course should have. So the president doesn't have the right to pardon a criminal, for example, unless the family of the victim somehow agrees to that. There are regulations and procedures that regulate these cases. So you cannot pardon thousands of people with one single decree, which is effectively happening. So we also get signals from Russian regions that people are increasingly afraid of the criminals coming from the front line. They come back to Russia and they commit crimes again. And the local population is usually terrified because those people ostentatiously demonstrate their impunity. And if they commit another crime, or if there is even a risk of them committing another crime, the population cannot react in any way, because those who try to react are usually, again, harassed by local officials or law enforcement bodies. We've seen some examples of the owners of restaurants or cafes or other institutions like places like that who tried to introduce the entry ban for those who came from the front because they were just afraid of the safety of their customers. And many of them fell victim of harassment from the local officials, local turbo-patriotic communities and so on. So people are growingly afraid to react also. this terrorizing of Russian population can become more serious in the foreseeable future, because we can expect the mass influx of traumatized war veterans to Russia, mass influx of weapons also. The scientific data on the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, say that 10 to 15% of such people will suffer from that like permanently throughout the rest of their lives. So they will pose a permanent threat to the society. And of course, no one in Russia will take care of them in a proper way, because there is no state system of helping the victims of PTSD. There is no state system of helping the victims of the victims, so the people who are the victims of violence from the part of the PTSD suffering people. And of course, also in Russia, there is no proper system of military training. So the war crimes, the mass brutal war crimes, smacking of genocide, in fact, that we witnessed in Ukraine, committed by the Russian soldiers. This is not a coincidence.
We're talking about targeting civilians, murder, brutality, rape.
Yeah, raping children, things like that. It's always been like that, many people would tell you. And in the Russian army is a very powerful tool of socialization of young men. So if in the army you experience violence on a daily basis, physical violence, psychological violence.
You experience meaning you are a victim of it.
You are a victim of it. So naturally, you go to the front. So again, you act in a very cruel way sometimes.
Okay, so Maria, you've painted a very bleak picture, and you did mention that many people were satisfied in Russia with the return of Putin. Would you say that the 90s and this lawlessness was worse than the present situation in Russia, or it's worse now?
It was different, but in one aspect, it is definitely much worse now. In the 90s, the violence and the wide criminalization of the social life, political life, it stemmed mostly from the weakness of the state. Mostly, not uniquely, but mostly. Now, the theoretically very strong and stable state, at least this is something that they want us to believe, is actively promoting violence as a tool of state management and as something totally normal in social life. So in this aspect, it's definitely worse now, because if in the 90s we had something that I would call like violence by default, I mean violence coming from the weak state and this disintegration of the state functions after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now it is being done on purpose, and now criminals rule Russia. And this is this criminal culture, this culture of violence is something that is encouraged by the state at virtually every single level of the whole state machine, including teaching children, educating children in the spirit of militarism and hatred and acceptance for repression as a means to restore social order, for example.
Okay, so it seems that a strong man returned to the leadership in Russia, and this strong man is Vladimir Putin. He was former FSB, and he, at least in his younger years, tried to project an image as a very macho man. Is this somehow symptomatic of the problem in the rest of society?
It is. Putin has for years been building his image as an alpha male in a very very much in a criminal spirit. I mean, he uses criminal language. He uses criminal methods, of course, and this is something that is presented as a feature of an efficient, strong leader. But in Russia, we deal with a much broader problem of the cult of toxic or hegemonic masculinity. So in Russia, we have a very precisely defined gender roles. A true man should be a dominant person. So a man can perform only two roles in the society. Either he dominates or he submits. If he submits, he is scorned and treated as he's automatically treated as a gay, and being a gay in Russia is an insult. I mean, if someone calls you a gay, you should feel insulted because there is widespread homophobia, again, promoted by the state. Aggression, dominance, hierarchy, control, also preemptive aggression. These are features that are widely perceived as positive features of true men. And this idea that in order not to be humiliated by others, you can preemptively attack, physically attack, that was also reflected in the very idea of the war against Ukraine. The narrative is that we have attacked Ukraine because otherwise they would have attacked us, which is total nonsense. But this is how it works in the propaganda, and surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, many women also contribute to the perpetuation of this pattern of toxic masculinity. It's also worth mentioning that this paradigm in recent years, especially in big cities, especially among the young people from the middle class, this paradigm, this pattern has started to be dismantled. I mean, many young people contest this notion of maleness, but usually
men and women,
yeah. But the state propaganda calls this attitude as fundamentally hostile to the basic civilizational values of the Russian Federation. So again, this kind of attitude, if you talk about women's rights, if you talk about LGBT plus rights, if you talk about that true men not necessarily should beat up the weaker, and so on and so on, this is treated like a blow against traditional values, and so many men go to the war now, not only because of very strong financial triggers, which is the number one among the motivations, but also they want to comply with this widespread social expectations as regards their traditional social gender role. It's also worth mentioning that while building his image as a very strong leader, a super male, an alpha male, and so on, Putin and all the Kremlin-sponsored propaganda portray many Western male politicians as weak, as effeminate, as gay-ish, I would say, which is, of course, intended to scorn them in the eyes of the Russian public. And there is also a very strong misogyny among the political leadership in Russia and among large groups in the Russian society. Women are another negative point of reference for Putin. So women are vulnerable and men are strong. And this is something that in other conditions, if Russia was a more or less liberal state, I think this trend could be reversed with a change of generations, for example. But now these traditional values and this toxic masculinity is also being taught at schools, which unfortunately carries a risk of perpetuating and entrenching even more this kind of the perception of the world, which means that the rights of the weak in Russia will be violated on a mass scale again and again. In democratic, civilized countries, I would say, you usually help the weak. And even if you don't do it, you know that this is good and socially accepted, encouraged to help the weak. In Russia, there is a large contempt towards the weak.
So you've painted a very, very dark picture today, but thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this OSW interview. If you enjoyed it, please check out our archive to find more interesting documentaries and discussions.